Okay, now that I've talked a little bit about government, the structure of government, federal, state, and local government, taxes and spending, I want to transition from that into talking about fiscal policy. Fiscal policy can basically be defined as the use of taxing and spending policies by the government to try to influence the economy one way or another. Now, since fiscal policy has to do with taxing and spending, those things happen because of bills that are passed by Congress and signed by the president. That means that if I ask you, subtle there, if I ask you who controls fiscal policy, you can't tell me the government does, okay? Because the Attorney General doesn't really have any control over that. The guys at the DMV don't have any control over that. The people who control fiscal policy are the President and the Congress. Now, hopefully you're remembering at this point that the use of fiscal policy at all implies that you belong to one of those schools of economics. For example, classical economists would never want this kind of policy, ever. Whereas a Keynesian might promote higher government spending in order to stimulate the economy, or a supply-side economist would want lower taxes to stimulate the economy. But this goes back to those things. It's a very Keynesian idea. Basically, there are two kinds of government policy when it comes to the economy. There are policies that are designed to stimulate growth, in other words, to cause GDP to go up. Okay, and those are called expansionary policies. The purpose of these policies is to cause the economy to expand. And the other kind of policy is a contractionary policy, and those kinds of policies are designed to cause the economy not to grow as quickly, usually not literally to contract. Usually the goal isn't for GDP actually to go down, but just to slow the growth of the economy. I'm going to talk later about why you would ever want to do something like that. Just to put it briefly, expansionary policies include raising spending, in other words, trying to boost aggregate demand, hopefully you're remembering that, and decreasing taxes. In other words, things that are going to put more money into people's pockets. So those are expansionary policies. And then contractionary policies are just the opposite. Those are raising taxes and cutting spending. So things that would take money out of the pockets of just people on the street. Now, in general, the goal of these policies and of any government policies regarding the economy is to boost growth, but also to gain stability in the business cycle. So the business cycle normally has GDP going up and then down again and then up again, and left on its own, there will also be probably long-term economic growth, so that each peak is higher than the previous peak. So even though it looks like a wave, that if you zoomed way out, it would still look like a line going up. What we want is for that business cycle to be less volatile. That means that when we're in a contraction, we want expansionary policies. We want the government to cut taxes and raise spending, if we're Keynesians. And in an expansion, then we might want the government actually to raise taxes and cut spending in order to slow that down. So why slow down growth? Why ever have a contractionary policy? Well, the reason is because typically when the economy is expanding, we run into the danger of inflation. Okay, inflation generally, especially in Keynesian analysis, tends to happen not during economic downturns, okay, but when the economy is expanding rapidly. Now, this is a complicated issue, but I just want to go over very briefly why inflation would be caused by an economic upswing. But basically, it's because more people want to invest. When the economy is going well, people expect that the economy will continue to do well. So more money is being invested, more money is moving around the economy more quickly. So that, effectively, even if the government doesn't print any more money, that effectively causes more money to be in use. It effectively increases the money supply. But also, unemployment tends to be very low, but businesses still want to expand. And they can only expand by hiring more workers. And the only way to hire more workers is to offer higher salaries. But if they're offering higher salaries, that's raising their cost of production. So they wanted to produce a lot more before, but now they're going to produce just a little bit more, and they're going to have to raise their prices to make up for this extra cost of production. But the higher the prices go, the higher demand or the higher salary everybody's going to demand. And this possibly could start what's called a wage price spiral. So for two reasons, economic upswings tend to be associated with inflation, and we use contractionary policies to fight inflation. For those of you who know your American history, the New Deal was all about this. So we had a big economic downturn, and previously economists had generally not wanted the government to be involved in the economy, but people began to believe that maybe the government had a role to play in pulling us out of the Great Depression. So we had the New Deal, lots of new government spending to try to juice the economy, to try to kickstart it back into life. Okay. There are a lot of economists who don't agree that the New Deal actually worked at all, that it actually may have extended the Great Depression, but that's a continuing source of debate. Those of you who know your ancient history may also be aware that Alexander the Great conquered practically all of the Middle East and Egypt and beyond in the span of well under one lifetime, and then died, leaving his empire to a number of successors. The subsequent Hellenistic age saw a flowering of scientific inquiry, philosophy, advances in art, architecture, engineering. That was really unprecedented compared to the age before. And undoubtedly part of that was because the world was culturally and politically unified in a way that it hadn't been previously. But also, these Macedonian and Greek generals came in, and the previous Persian practice had largely been, if you're an aristocrat, have a palace full of gold and treasures and things like that. And the Greeks were not the same way. They came in, got all that gold, and spent it. And a lot of people think, or some people think, that this actually represented the first and largest Keynesian economic stimulus of all time. Anyway. Now, I know you teenagers and your ways, and that many of you are thinking, yeah, okay, yawn, fiscal policy, only a couple more weeks until I have to forget this. Well, and you're probably not going to be surprised when I tell you that this actually is extremely important for you to know. And if you don't think this is very important, just find somebody who's lost their job over the last couple of years and ask them whether they think it's important. Okay, this has everything to do with the kind of job you're going to get, whether or not you're able to get a job. Okay, we need the government to enact the best kinds of policies, or else things could be really bad. There are a number of reasons why this kind of policy is controversial. One of them is that the point of the policies is to flatten out the business cycle, but if they're timed badly, so if you enact expansionary policy just when the economy is beginning to recover, or you enact contractionary policy just when the economy is beginning to fall again, you could actually make that cycle worse. These kinds of policies are also controversial because expansionary policies cause debt, because you're decreasing taxes and increasing spending, and when you do that, you're going to have to borrow money, at least for the time being. So the question becomes, if you run into a situation where you have a large amount of debt, and either you have a really slow expansion or an outright contraction of the economy, what do? Do you pile up more debt, or do you worry more about the debt? Maybe undertaking contractionary policies, even though you're already contracting, just to try to pay down that debt. Another problem, though, goes a little deeper philosophically, and that is that under Keynesian or just any kind of fiscal policy, it doesn't really matter what the new spending is if the government increases spending. It could be on things that nobody will ever use. It could be on pyramids. It could be on something that is practically nothing, like people digging a ditch and then filling it in again. All of that stuff is going to stimulate the economy. So in a sense, it doesn't really matter. And you can defend old spending, even old spending that everybody thinks is pretty much useless, by saying, well, at least it stimulates the economy. Whereas on the other side of the coin is that if we're spending resources and getting nothing in exchange, that's a pure loss in some sense. If you're spending resources, you should be spending it on something worthwhile. So do you pay attention to the stimulus part of it, this Keynesian part, or do you pay attention to the fact that spending a bunch of money on pyramids or on having people dig a hole and then fill it in again is really not productive? That's just literally a waste of money. Which side are you going to fall on there? A lot of battles are currently being fought over this very thing. A lot of political battles have been over things like the stimulus. Is it a good idea or is it not a good idea? The whole Tea Party thing, the whole idea behind that is that, we really have to deal with the debt, not try to stimulate the economy. And that maybe stimulus is just a waste of resources in the end anyway. That was what the sequester was about too. The sequester was just automatic spending cuts that were going to happen as a result of a failure to come to a larger agreement about spending. and Keynesians suggested that it would be catastrophic that the government would stop spending something like $80 billion. And people who wanted the sequester said it's not going to be that disastrous. So that's fiscal policy, the president and Congress's use of taxing and spending policies, and that can be at the federal, state, or local level, but to try to stimulate the economy through expansionary policies like raising spending or cutting taxes, or to try to hold the economy back, not shrink it, but to fight inflation by raising taxes and cutting spending.